I don't think Rajiv Malhotra needs any introduction here, but still I will say a few words about his book, Being Different. We had a very interesting session today in Zakir, in Pondicherry, with many questions and many comments. This is the book, and the book is there available for everyone who is in this session. And it is very provocative, very interesting. It reverses the whole view on our interaction with the East-West relations, and we can already, I thought it will be the beginning of studying the West from the Eastern point of view, which is also very valid and very needed in this time. So
we should also say that Rajiv has contributed a good amount of money for the purchase of land in Auroville. So he's had a long association.
And we did the women's project. When what's it?
Bhavna?
No, Bhavna Beach.
But he presented about $1 million to the land purchase in Auroville at the time. Infinity Foundation had long association.
I'm not mentioning even that because he founded many projects, and myself and many other researchers who are doing research. So it is his major thing. Now it is he becomes a philosopher, and it's quite interesting to see him in this new role.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being here. Actually, I was originally a philosopher who decided to become a scientist, so I can understand philosophy from a scientist's point of view. And then physics led me to computer science. Then I got into the industry. Then I became a corporate guy. You know how one thing leads to the next, you don't know where you'll end up. Then I became a businessman. Then I suddenly realized, oops, I better get back to where I was. So that's when I left everything in '94 and started foundation and started doing my own sadhana and my own research. And yeah, so this I'll skip everything else, but just come to the point on this book. This book is the outgrowth, the byproduct of another book, which is called the U-turn theory. Yeah, I will explain it. I will explain it. And that book will come out next. The U-turn theory is a study of. I lived in the US for 40 years, so I've been part of many stages of the Indian spiritual experience entering the US. The New Age movement and the gurus, and then gurus have scandals, and then gurus are no good, and then something else comes in, and that whole, all the different stages I've experienced. So I was interested in understanding why it is that, I wanted to understand the Western journey into Indian spiritual traditions. And it was very quick to it was very easy to understand that the Western experience of Indian traditions keeps shifting over time. People enter, then they change their view, they go on to some other view, some of them go back. And some of them, when they go back to their previous tradition, they are changed, they are transformed, they don't go back returning where they started. And they take back several things from the Indian tradition and leave several things behind, depending on what will fit. And then they they kind of come up with a synthesis. So let's say they left as a Christian, they come back as a Christian, but maybe different denomination, or they left as a Jewish person, they come back as that, or they come back as a Westerner who's an atheist, you know. And they're transformed by the experience that they've had. And I wanted to find out why they go back. What in the Indian spiritual tradition is such that they cannot just stay there? What would cause them to bounce back? And I interviewed a lot of people. I went to yoga centers where there's lots of Americans doing yoga. I went to ashrams, and both in India and in the US, and interviewed a large number of people over the last 15-20 years. And then I that is one input to this project. Another is I was in one of these places in Auroville giving a talk, And I was also interviewed, and that interview came in some local newsletter. I don't know, there's Bindu, there was a person called Bindu. She did an interview and it came in the Auroville something.
Today.
And in that interview, my top subject was how in the in the American Academy, because when I say West, my experience is only American, not European, because I don't know much about Europe. So in the American Academy, there is philosophy is not, Indian philosophy is studied more like a religion rather than in the philosophy department as a philosophy. And there's a big difference in the American Academy between a philosophy and a religion. Or it's studied as anthropology or social sciences, but it's not studied as a philosophy per se. And yet, so much that is being borrowed from the Indian tradition into cognitive science, neuroscience, is not explained as such. It is sort of recharacterized as Western. So the original source is sort of left behind, and it is the people who are the bridge, who bring the knowledge back. They position themselves as the new pioneers, as their original discovery. They become the new gurus, the new founding fathers of this new kind of science, new neuroscience or whatever science they're developing. So I wanted to understand that, and I was giving a talk here, and I was also talking about some of the stereotypes in the American Academy towards Indian religion, which I've critiqued and I've written many books on that. Some of you probably know some of that. It stirred up a lot of controversy. And then somebody here in the audience, a Frenchman, whom I forget, and I'd love to get connected with him again, he asked an interesting question, which made me think. And he said, what made the West change in this posture towards India from once upon a time during the Romantic period? Voltaire and people like that were really in romance of India, and they were really in awe of India. It was the original homeland, and it was the great place, it was the paradise. They were called the Romantics, the European Romantics in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And so, why did that go away? Why isn't that there today? That was his question, and I could not at the time answer it. But I thought it was a very good question. So I started thinking about it, and I started researching Indology, European Indology, to see how the Germans, French, and the English studied Sanskrit and the Sanskrit texts starting from the late 1700s till the early 1900s. Over a period of about 150 years, a lot of major European universities had Indology and Sanskrit studies. But suddenly, after a huge amount was learned and a huge amount of mining was done, these departments were phased out, and now there's very few of those left. And but it's also easy to find out that it's also easy to figure out that a lot of the knowledge they gained from the study of these texts gave rise to many European disciplines like linguistics from the study of Panini. And Vladimir has done a monograph on the influences of Sanskrit upon European thinkers. Comparative religion started that way. A whole lot of some philosophy, the philosophical influences on people like Hegel. So it seems that this thing I'm calling the U-turn, which I was studying in the modern context of the 60s and beyond, has happened before also. So there have been U-turns before, because the Romantics in the late 1700s went, but that experience of India was not long term. It went for a few decades, and then they moved on to a critique of India and a rejection of India. But at the same time, while rejecting the source, they had gained a lot, which they've reclassified as Western thought. There are some books on the Indian influences on the European Enlightenment. Several books. There's one by J.J. Clark, and a couple others have written these kind of books. So I decided that I should understand this phenomenon, because it seems to recur several times in the Western history, that they go out to the East, there's a period of excitement, they learn a lot, but then it's not a permanent thing. They make a U-turn back to their homeland, they bring some stuff with them, and sometimes the Indian source gets rejected as inferior. So I developed this U-turn theory, and the question in the U-turn theory that all the people who are my reviewers have been asking is, why the U-turn? What about the Indian tradition is unacceptable? Is there a rejection? Is there sort of a return back to one's historical ancestry. Is that the reason? Or is there something wrong with Indian tradition? What is the factors? And also when they return back to the West, why is it only certain things they can take back and not everything else? So that led to this book, the U-Turn book. But then it became a very large book, and somebody suggested that the philosophical part of what is different between India and the West should be removed to make it simpler. And I removed that, and that what I had removed became this book. So this book talks about what are the philosophical differences between the Indian philosophy and worldview and the Western, and it looks at it from an Indian point of view, because typically these kind of comparative studies have been done from the Western point of view, either by Westerners or Westernized Indians. And this is reversing the gaze from the Indian point of view upon the West. So that's what this book is, to understand, what is unusual, different, peculiar, exotic about the West from an Indian point of view, reversing the anthropology. Like if the Westerners were native informants, what would a person with an Indian gaze find interesting about Westerners? And I just want to preface that when I say Western thought, I'm not referring to every Western person, because many Western persons I know are more Indian than a lot of Indians are. And also a lot of Indians I know are more Western than many Westerners are. So when I say Western thought, I'm talking about what has historically and traditionally emerged from the West. That doesn't mean that every Westerner is part of it or believes in it or subscribes to it. A lot of them reject it. So please keep that in mind, because I'm not implicating that all Westerners are a certain way. Now, the book, normally the fashionable thing to do in these East-West studies is to show that things are the same, that everybody's same. Vasudeva Kutumbakam, we all have red blood, and we all made of the same electrons and protons. We heard some people say those things in the morning. There's one Brahman, and we're all aspiring for some higher truth. So all kind of things are same. But then, an orange is in that sense same as an apple, because they're round and they're fruits, and they roughly cost the same amount of money, and they grow on a tree. Or you could say a bicycle is the same as a car, because they have wheels and they're made of steel and they go on a road. But while there are similarities, things aren't the same. There's also important differences. So I'm focusing on those differences. And a related concept is the concept of digestion of one civilization by another. So by digestion, I mean the so-called pagan faiths and cultures were assimilated into Christianity. A lot of Christianity came from there. So they got digested, and the pagans themselves sort of disappeared or marginalized. So digestion is sort of not just a friendly assimilation, because it depletes the source. A byproduct is it depletes the source. That's why I call it digestion. And the example I give is, when a tiger digests a deer, there is no more deer left. There is a stronger tiger. And the deer keeps getting broken into smaller parts, starting with the teeth, broken into smaller parts. And as it goes through the digestive tract, it keeps getting broken into smaller and smaller bits. And even one copy of the deer DNA cannot survive in the tiger's body, because it would be toxic. If the tiger's cells are only tiger DNA, there isn't any copy of deer DNA, it would be a foreign object, it would be toxic, and the tiger cannot accept that. So the tiger has to break it down, even molecules, even a DNA molecule has to be broken into parts, into little smaller parts, atoms, and then it has to be reassembled in the bloodstream, and so various places it has to be reassembled back into tiger DNA and put in different places, so the tiger becomes stronger. So the digestion means sort of taking apart a civilization, using this metaphor, it's taking apart a civilization, finding what's useful, reconfiguring it into the host civilization, and what is not useful is excreted, so it's waste. Or at the level of the teeth, it's not taken in the first place. So some parts are left out of the digestion, either way. And so if you look at the history of civilizations, a lot of civilizations have been digested by others. It's not just the West doing it. It's Greece digested a lot of Egyptian civilization. A lot of Greek thought came from Egypt. And then Greece got digested by the Roman Europeans, so got into the West and so on. So this idea of digestion has relevance here because when I'm looking for difference, between the Indian and the Western civilization, I'm looking especially for the non-digestible difference. I'm looking for, because I want to find out why the people U-turn, so I must find out what is it that they cannot digest. Because if they could digest it, they would digest it. So for instance, if becoming vegetarian is digestible, because Westerners can become vegetarian, so one can just digest it. But there may be certain things that they cannot digest, and I want to find out what they are. And that may be the cause of U-turns, perhaps, because there's something one cannot digest. So one then rejects that part of it and goes back to one's source. And I came up with 4 or 5 major points of non-digestible difference, and those are the chapters of the book. So each chapter is an item of non-digestibility. Yeah, that's what this book is for. So I will go through these briefly, and then we'll have question answers. The implication of this is that if we understand where these boundaries are, as to how far the Westerner can go into the East, and then say I won't go any further, I want to understand why. What will happen if they go further? And a good tip came from T.S. Eliot's experience of Sanskrit texts, because he's very honest, and so he's not sort of hiding his U-turn. He's very honest. And T.S. Eliot was at Harvard and studying Sanskrit and reading many Sanskrit texts. And in his notes on Sanskrit, Upanishads and Gita, various texts, he translates some of those in the margin into English. And those are exact words that are found in the 4 quartets and the Wasteland and some of his most important poetry. There's a scholar in Princeton called Cleo Kearns, who I worked with. She did her PhD dissertation on T.S. Eliot and Indic traditions, and there's a book published by Cambridge University Press on that very point. And she went and researched all these original sources, which are not commonly known about T.S. Eliot, as to the extent to which his poetry was basically translations of Sanskrit texts. Now he goes through this phase, and then he writes something very interesting. He says that this is so profound, the Indian thought that is contained in the Sanskrit text is so profound that, to use his words, it makes the Western philosophers look like schoolboys. That's his description of how different the thought is. And then he actually contemplates, at one point in time, he contemplates moving to India and just going all the way and just becoming part of this Sanskrit, Vedic kind of thinking, stop being who he is and turn himself over into this new discovered civilization. And then he reflects that before I can do that, I have to understand that the price of doing that will be I'll no longer be an Englishman. I'll no longer be an American. I'll have to cut off from my peers. I'll have to dislocate myself from my sense of history and who I am. And then he has to decide whether it's worth it, whether he can manage to do that or not, and he changes his mind and decides that I'll stay put and think of myself as a Westerner. Then he baptizes as a middle-aged man, which is very unusual. It's almost like he now has to cleanse himself of all these things that might have entered him, all these influences that might have entered him, because he's neither here nor there. He feels like he's not properly, purely Western, and he's not given that up either and become an Indian per se in his mindset. So he's kind of like a mixture of both. And now to recover and get back to being, who he is, he gets a public baptism in Boston. So it's It's not only an unusual thing to be baptized at that age, but to a very public display, ceremonial kind of, be baptized. To sort of tell the world, now I've gone back to my Christian roots. And then he continues, he says he can continue studying Sanskrit and enjoy it as the other. He's no longer at risk that it will kind of pull him in like it was. So he's built a shield around his baptism, and the public identity gives him a sense of security, that now I'm safe from this awesome thing that might just pull me in. You see? So that's a very interesting smoking gun for me in my research, because he's so open about it. Another interesting person is Jung. Jung, in the 1930s, he used to teach summer institutes in Zurich on Kundalini Yoga, Patanjali Yoga, Tantra, chakras, these kind of things. And he used these terms. He was not pretending that it's something original. He was using these terms. But then his demarcation was determined by the fact how far he could go and what else he had to reject, was determined by the fact that he was reimagining Christianity. He was trying to take the biblical story and reinterpret it using these Indian ideas that he had learned. So this got him into trouble and arguments with many bishops. Many of the church people did not think that this reinterpretation was a valid one. And so he was, on the one hand, having many arguments with the church people. And then, on the other hand, he was experimenting with these Indian traditions and using them, teaching them, and using them to reinterpret Christianity. So he concludes that he's willing to accept up to 5 chakras, but the 6th and 7th, where there is unity consciousness, transcendence, and loss of individuality, he's not able to fit into the biblical story, and he rejects it. So he says that 6th and 7th chakra claims by yogis is some sort of pathology. There's something wrong with them. Maybe there's some weirdness or some, but it's not authentic. It cannot be scientifically validated. He never had those experiences, and he doesn't recommend to Westerners to experiment with that. And he says that if you go beyond a certain level of yoga, it's dangerous for Westerners, because you do not know what may hit you if you were to go into that uncharted territory. So his place of U-turn is very clearly defined. It's it's what will fit into Christianity as reimagined by him, and the rest that he could not utilize is non-digestible. So that is his non-digestibility criteria. So I looked at all sorts of things, and I'm going to write, I've got a plan to write 6 more volumes on the U-turn theory. The next one will be the theoretical framework, and then different domains of knowledge that are U-turning, where thought is being digested, and what is not digestible I'm trying to identify, that is left out. And then I want to have a tension between what is left out and what is taken, and whether that boundary is a real genuine boundary, whether it's authentic, or whether what is left out really belongs also. And why, and what would happen if what is left out is also put back in. Yeah? One of the domains of knowledge that I will have a book on is Ken Wilber, which may interest some of you. I'm doing a volume on Ken Wilber's appropriations of Sri Aurobindo, Kashmir Shaivism, Buddhism, and then the claim that he's exceeded it, superseded it, and rejected parts of it because it wasn't good enough, and he's gone beyond it. So I'm doing a whole critique of that, and I will have a book ready on that also. Excuse me? Yeah?
Nothing.
Okay, sorry. Good. Yeah. So the 4 areas of difference I'm going to describe now, having given you sort of a background as to what I'm trying to achieve with it. One area of difference is that there is a philosophical foundation starting with Judeo-Christianity, and then it continues with Hegel and Enlightenment movement also, with a huge emphasis on what I call history centrism. History centrism is a sort of a claim that there is a unique history, there is some uniqueness of history, usually linear history, prophetic history generally, or Hegel, without using prophets, had a historicity of the West, which was very unique and very exclusive. So there is a unique history, and this history is exceedingly important. You cannot do without knowing about this history. And in the case of Christianity, the path to salvation is through unique historical events. And I contrasted this with what I call embodied knowing in the here and now. That's what the yoga is. And Adhyatma Vidya, the inner science. And the idea of Satchitanand, which is the divine manifested as all of us. So I show in one of the chapters the incompatibility between the history centrism as a premise, which is the underlying premise of the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is sort of mandatory in most denominations of Christianity, and often recited. And the Nicene Creed starts with, Adam and Eve's original sin, and then the virgin birth, and then, crucifixion, redemption, all of that. The major milestones of that history are required to be accepted as cardinal truth and articles of faith. And I try to show whether ideas of karma, reincarnation can fit with that, and I find they are not mutually compatible. They are indigestible. And also whether the idea of human being divine, to begin with the idea of Tattvamasi, whether that can be made compatible with this sort of Nicene Creed. And I've read a lot of people who attempted it. A lot of Catholic theologians have been attempting this for the last 100 years. Théa de Chardin, Bede Griffiths, many recent people, Jesuits, they're trying this, and I've studied all of them. And one of the volumes will be specifically on reinventing Christianity in the last 100 years, rethinking Christianity in the last 100 years in the light of a lot of study of Hindu and Buddhist sources. Buddhism also has played a large role in this reimagining Christianity. So therefore I'm not making the statement that Christianity has to be history-centric, it just happens to be. It doesn't have to be, but that's the way it's turned out to be, because of the power of the institution, and institutions find things more controllable if you can have absolute mandates and absolute things and unique things, exclusivity that nobody else has. So these are all instruments of control. And of course, I know that there are mystics, and I've talked about it in this. There are Christian mystics who have also had higher experiences and unity consciousness experiences, but somehow they've been on the margins and they've been persecuted sometimes or left out and not allowed to, not encouraged by mainstream society to build lineages over a long period of time. So it is not that there is something that in Christianity you couldn't be doing that, but it's just that it hasn't happened to the same extent as it happened in India.
You mentioned in the book that they are, sorry to tell, but this is an important point, that they were always welcome when they were dead. 100 years afterwards, they were all canonized.
Well, the saints in Christianity have to be dead before they can become a saint. And that's a law. That's a law. You cannot have living saints. So I've looked at why is that so. And a living saint would probably threaten the institution. Because imagine if there is a corporate body, an institution, and there's the head of this institution, he's sort of like a CEO. But then there's this one man or one woman somewhere all by themselves who are enlightened. People are going to go there. And they're not going to go to some, institution. They're going to go to the person who embodies the truth, because this person is what we're trying to become. Whereas the institution is just sort of teaching you some historical stuff about what happened and so on. So this threat of a living master is a very serious threat. And so in the book I explain that either you have a tradition of living masters, in which case institutions will not build up very well. And in India you have that problem that when a guru is dead, the people fall apart and some other guru comes up and then they all go here and there. So after the guru, continuity is very difficult in the Indian system, because people are not drawn towards an institution. They are drawn towards a living master. And in the West, the church, being very smart, understanding that's the risk, have gotten rid of those people. And then when the guy is dead, you can declare them, canonize them, and now a dead guy doesn't talk back. You can fabricate whatever history you want, and the person is your property. You can put up a statue, and you can do fundraising in their name, and you can have their what are those things called? Their articles, you know.
Relics.
Relics. You can have relics, and that's your property. You can have a museum. You can put a ticket there. You can, you know, whatever. You can do all kinds of things because now the dead saint is good property. The living saint is a big nuisance, and a big pain, a big threat. So I've given all the reasons why one civilization went towards embodied knowing, living saint, living enlightened beings, Adhyatma Vidya evolving over generations and generations, so different rishis, different yogis experimenting, teaching others, and they experimenting further, like a laboratory of an inner experience. And the other civilization, not because there's something wrong with those people there, but because this institution is so powerful and considers that sort of thing to be a threat, so it has done away with it and later on turned them into products. So it's like the institution digesting a dead saint and turning them into some kind of an artifact, an ornament that has power, that gives them more power. That's what has happened. So the first point of contrast in this book is between the ethos of history centrism and the ethos of embodied knowing or Adhyatma Vidya or Satchitanand. And this is very important because those of you in Europe might not suffer this as much, but in the US I found that it's very difficult to get people out of that historical identity, also known as American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is a term that we are somehow exceptional people, and from the founding fathers and from our European origins and back to Rome and back to Jerusalem, all of that, and it's taught, and all our kids, my kids are raised there, born and raised there, so they're taught this from childhood. And so this sense of history, this grand narrative of history is very large and very powerful in the US. And so this history centrism has the quality of exclusivity because history tends to be inviolable. So if you're claiming something that doesn't fit, if it fits, I can digest it. If it doesn't fit, then it's a cause for a clash. There's something wrong. Good example between history centrism and versus another history centrism is the clash of Christianity and Islam. So you want to, this is not, you can say that they all believe in one God and they all have common stuff and all that, but the point is why are they still clashing? And that's because the mandatory core requirement of one violates the core requirements of the other. Example, the status of Jesus is different and irreconcilable between the two. Jesus has to be Son of God in Christianity. He cannot just be a wise guy, a prophet, a yogi, or a rishi, because none of those will redeem the original sin. Original sin is because of what Adam and Eve do, and the curse is that all future progeny of Adam and Eve will be born sinners and eternally damned. So the condition is so huge and so infinite that no amount of tapas by an ordinary human being is going to remedy that. You cannot solve such a huge problem which is sort of part of the mankind's DNA because of what Adam and Eve did, and so you cannot just fix it. So when God wants to solve the problem because he feels sorry for man, there has to be a very massive event, one-time big event, one unique event, and he has to have his son take incarnation, and then through his sacrifice, which is a substitution for humanity's sacrifice. This is called substitutional atonement. That's the technical name in the Bible. So Jesus' sacrifice is a substitutional atonement for other people. They don't need to sacrifice because he already did. And to avail of this value of Jesus' sacrifice, you have to believe in the historical event. So that the historical event becomes mandatory if you want to get saved. And if you do not believe in that on your own, you cannot get saved. Now the virgin birth is necessary because if Jesus had been born of a human father and human mother, then he would be progeny of Adam and Eve, and he too would be born a sinner. So the only way he can be exempt from that condition of being born a sinner is if he's not progeny of Adam and Eve, and that means there has to be virgin birth, because that virgin birth means he's not progeny of Adam and Eve. Yeah? So on the other hand, in Islam, they respect Jesus. Jesus is one of the greatest prophets. and Jesus is to be respected a lot in Islam. Quran says that. But Jesus cannot be considered Son of God. He has to be a prophet. He's downgraded from Son of God to being a prophet. There is no Son of God. God has never incarnated in Islam. Never incarnated. So you ask, why is that so? Can't we just talk those very nice, wonderful Islamic people in the interfaith dialogue? Hey, listen, just take him as Son of God and we are in harmony. The point is, it will invalidate the entire Islam, because a mortal human prophet, which is what they consider, the Muslims consider Muhammad to be, a regular human-born prophet cannot override the message of the Son of God. Son of God is a unique, much higher stature, God Himself, and what He has said cannot be updated, cannot be corrected, cannot be superseded by a human mortal prophet. So for the Quran to sort of be a successor to the Bible, it has to, there are two choices. One, they could have said that God had a second son, so the second son supersedes the first son, but that wouldn't work because it would violate the biblical thing that there is one son and whatnot. So they chose the other method, which also violates the Bible's view, and that is to bring Jesus down from Son of God to being a prophet, and now you have a prophet being replaced by a newer prophet. So for Islam to work, the core condition of Christianity has to be violated, that He's Son of God. And for Christianity to work, you cannot accept that He's just a prophet. So you can sit and they keep arguing, but this is a logical problem, that the validity of one as defined will negate the other as defined. And this is true in both directions. So it's not a simple matter. This is all because of history-centrism. This is because both are history-centric. And if they were to not be history-centric and talk about let's have love and let's be all one and all that, and there's one God, we have different ways of praying, many paths leading to one family. If it were just that, which means all the history-centrism is not being talked about, then of course you would not have these clashes. So a whole lot of the interfaith dialogue about oneness and harmony, you will notice very carefully in those conversations, they skip the history-centrism, whereas the history-centrism is the very DNA which keeps that faith together. And the history-centrism is absolutely necessary when they're preaching in the house of worship. And so this interfaith is a bit of a facade, because the real problem area is not really comfortable to talk about. So this is an example of a non-digestible difference, because the histories, if people in Dharmic traditions were to accept the Nicene Creed or the historical uniqueness of Christ, that results in negating all the avatars. That results in refuting basic premises of Dharma traditions. And on the other hand, for the Christian to accept that there can be any number of enlightened beings, and there is no limit to how many avatars there can be, means that rather than the essence being sinner and damned, the essence is Satchitanand. So what is the nature of the self is not reconcilable, because the ultimate self as a sinner and the ultimate self as Satchitanand are irreconcilable differences. I get visits from evangelists in my town. I live in Princeton, and so there's a local training ground, and before they send them off to places like India, they want to give them experience in the neighborhood. So they have to all go to the neighborhood, knock at doors and get experienced, and then when they're trained sufficiently, then they are sent off somewhere. So I recognize them because they're all extremely well groomed, they're very nicely dressed, and they're young people. There's usually 3 or 4 of them. So I can tell that that's who they are. When they ring the doorbell, I invite them, and offer them tea and talk to them very nicely and pretend like I'm this, guy who doesn't know anything, So they feel nicely welcome. And then they sit down, they small talk, they say small talk sort of things, curious little things. And I also engage in small talk. And then somebody among them has to break the ice and get to the point, And that's part of the training. How do you open? So somebody then typically says something like, "Have you heard the good news?" And of course, you all know the good news is that the Savior has come to save you. And I pretend like I don't know, you know. So I say, what good news, you know, did the stock market go up? What good news? Good news. So then they feel, you know, wow, we got to really educate this guy. So they say, you know, good news, you know, we can all be saved, you know about we have a savior. So I say, saved from what? Because I want them to talk about sin. I don't want to say anything about it. And so we keep going around until, you know, they're trained to expect a different answer. They're trained that the guy will say, oh yeah, I've been saved. Then they'll say, how? And then they'll get it. Say, no, you couldn't have been saved because it was not through the Son of God. You know? So they are trained. But I don't fall for that. So I kind of pretend like I don't know what is this, saved from what. And they say, from sin. I say, no, but I don't think I've done anything wrong. I don't think you've done anything wrong. You look like decent people. What have you done wrong, you know, that you need to be saved? So they're also thrown off a little bit. And then they talk about that there is original sin. And, you know, one of them has to get into this heavy philosophy that we're all sinners. And the good news is that there is a Savior. And we've come here to tell you about the good news. So I tell him, oh wow, have you heard the Dharma good news? So they all kind of look like, no, we don't, Dharma good news, no. So I said the Dharma good news is there is no original sin and we're all originally divine. We're all Satchitanand, we're all originally divine. So that's the Dharma good news. And so I think the two are incompatible in the sense that in one case a doctor comes to you and says, I have good news that I can cure your disease. And in fact, I'm the only one who can cure it. That's good news to know. And then another doctor comes and says, I have good news, you don't have that disease. So there's a difference in the two kinds of good news. So this is basically in essence of one chapter which talks about the difference, the role played by historicity. And I've tried this in any number of American audiences. I have tried this in, after 9/11 they asked a representative of each faith to come and give a talk to the government leaders, top government officials, because the government decided to sensitize its people about other faiths, because there was this belief that we need to know more about other religions. And we are this isolated from other parts of the world and we don't know enough and we need to, because 9/11 reminds us we don't even understand anybody else. So there were people from different religions brought to give some seminar and I was asked on Hinduism to give a talk. It was a big auditorium, several hundred people. They were all government officials, lawyers and, you know, senators, congressmen, well-educated class of people. And rather than telling them Hinduism is this, that, and this about Krishna, or this about this one, that one, I basically wanted to ask them some questions. So I started by asking, how many of you, what do you think will happen to your religious life if history is lost? In other words, suppose there is no history, for whatever reason. You know, maybe you're raised in an island somewhere, nobody taught you history. Or history is falsified, or history somehow magically all records are lost. What happens to your ability to be a religious person? And it's amazing that, you know, not one of them said that being divine, we will eventually, maybe it'll take a long time, but eventually somebody or other will recover that truth by having a higher experience. All of them were of the opinion that if they didn't have access to history, we would be doomed into darkness. We would be doomed because God and man have an infinite gap, and this gap is not something that the ordinary person and a human being has the potential to bridge upward. This gap is only bridged when God chooses to send a messenger who tells us this good news or gives us God's edicts or commandments. So it's a top-down system of communication. And in this top-down system of communication, we have people called prophets, and therefore we have to study the history of those prophets, what they said, what they did, what God said to them. And the study of the historical record of the lives of these prophets is the messages of God that we have access to. Otherwise, we have no access to messages of God possible. And if this history were ever lost, we would be in darkness. This is kind of in a nutshell, a paraphrase of what one hears when one goes to people who think of themselves as Judeo-Christian and you ask this question, what about, can you be a person of your faith with no history? Read a text, but not one sentence about historicity. Let's see if faith is possible. So this sort of thing reinforced my concept of history centrism. Last night I had a conversation with Sunit Verma, who's a psychology professor at Delhi University and a Sri Aurobindo follower. And the question I posed is, how is the historicity of Sri Aurobindo different from what I've called history centrism? And he gave a wonderful answer. I think you should know that. He said that certainly Sri Aurobindo brought us access to a new level of consciousness. There's a historical event which brought us access to a new level of consciousness. But since this level of consciousness is now universally available, it is available to those who do not know anything about Sri Aurobindo. You do not have to know the historicity of Sri Aurobindo. You do not have to say, I am doing this through Sri Aurobindo. You have access to this consciousness. Whether if you do the right yoga, you have access to this level of consciousness without having to subscribe to any unique historical event per se. It's sort of like Newton discovers laws of physics, laws of gravitation. So I can utilize them, and they work for me. I don't have to believe in it. I don't need the historicity of Newton's life. I don't need to know who he was, where he lived, what year it was, what he said. Did the apple fall on his head? Was it a banana? Or maybe some rock fell on his head? Or maybe that story is made up. It makes no difference to the validity of Newtonian laws today. So, therefore, when we say history, when we say we're free from history centrism, we're not saying that we don't have a history. I mean, there is a history of Newton, but physics is not history-centric because it's not contingent upon that historicity. It's not contingent upon belief in that historicity. So this subtle difference between having a history and having history-centrism is extremely important, because having history-centrism is what causes exclusivity, dogma, and conflict. And having a history, just regular history, but not history-centric, you're not boxed in, because it's more open and more flexible. So that's one point of difference. Second point of difference is that, and each of these is a chapter. Second point of difference is, I think, probably where this group will relate to a lot. I have defined a concept I call integral unity, and the contrarian idea I've called it synthetic unity or artificial unity. So integral unity is an inbuilt inherent unity, so the parts are not artificially later on put together to make a whole thing. The parts already are unified because they are not separately existing. Their existence is contingent upon the unity, the unified entity. The one exists, and the parts are relative to this one, or manifestations of this one. So the idea of Brahman is integral unity, because the Brahman as something that manifests as everything else and enters everything else, involution as everything else, makes these parts appear to us as separately existing, but in fact there is inherent unity. That is an integral unity worldview. The synthetic unity or artificial unity worldview is where the parts separately exist, and then somehow they have to be put together. So like in the case of a car, the tires exist, they're made in a factory, the battery exists, the paint exists, the steering exists. The parts have separately been made, and then they're assembled into an entity. And similarly, you could say the United Nations is a synthetic unity of, because every country separately exists, has its own sovereignty, and the United Nations is a kind of an artificial, gathering to achieve the individual needs through that congregation, that collection. But it's not like the UN is a unified entity and that is primordial and that is primary and all the nations have to achieve the UN agenda. It's the other way around. The UN is a means for other nations, not the other way around. So the supremacy of the unity in one case and the priority of the parts in the other case is what defines the difference. And then I show that, that is in the whole chapter, I show that both the Judeo-Christian and the Greek tradition are built of separate essences that come together. God, cosmos are separate, inherently separate, and souls are separate entities with separate existence. Even in heaven, you live in God's house, but you're not unified. It's not unity consciousness. You're separate from God. You're separate from souls, but you live in a nice mansion. You play golf and you drink. You eat Godiva chocolates and have a good life. It's a retirement community, but everybody's a separate existing entity. And in Greek thought, the Aristotelian law of excluded middle says things are yes, no, binary. There's no middle. There's no fuzzy middle ground. There's no uncertainty. There's no things that are neither yes nor no. Whereas in Indian logic, like in Jain logic, you have yes, no, neither yes nor no, both yes and no, and so on. There's many possible outcomes to a question, and not just a binary. So this law of the excluded middle created mutually exclusive things, and that became the origin, the foundation of the secular part, the Enlightenment part of the West, having itself been built of separate essences, because the whole Aristotelian philosophy is that there exist separate essences, and then they are put together into a cosmos. So the Western the Bible's theology starts with importing Aristotelian thought into the Bible by Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine merges Bible with Aristotle, and the result is the beginning of theology. So that's another synthesis. It's a synthesis of the Hebraic tradition, which is Judeo-Christianity, and the Hellenistic tradition, which is Greek thought, into this thing. And there are many fusions attempted. Hegel attempts another one, And so I show in one of the chapters a series of things that are the historical milestones and landmarks of the West, which produce an entity which is held together philosophically and in terms of the worldview, held together very artificially. And this is an important distinction between integral unity and synthetic unity, that the synthetic unity is held together by force because it's not natural, and there's always the fear that it will fall apart. So force is used to keep things together. And this fear that the synthetic unity may fall apart not only produces excessive use of force, which is characteristic of such a civilization, but also fear of chaos, because chaos is a state where things fall apart. Things can fall apart and there's anarchy and whatever, all kinds of horrible things can happen. Whereas somebody grounded in the idea of Brahman or the idea of any kind of integral unity, Buddhists without having Brahman have integral unity. They have a different idea of integral unity, but it's an integral unity. The Jains have that idea also. So all the Dharma traditions have that integral unity. Somebody grounded in that does not have to fear that things will fall apart, because how can things fall apart which are when there is already oneness? That's the original nature of reality to begin with. So ultimately nothing can fall apart. Ultimately it can appear to fall apart, but what is the ultimate reality? It cannot fall apart. That's how strong this unity is. So the next chapter, which talks about the difference, is called Order and Chaos. And Order and Chaos is an interesting chapter because it deals with the Western fear of chaos and the Indian comfort with chaos, relatively speaking. Comfort with chaos. I have a discussion group with 2,500 people discussing this book. Somebody just last week posted, or a few days ago posted, that Oprah must have read this book because Oprah just came to India and she made a statement about how people are all comfortable with chaos and stuff like that. Almost, and he put her statement and he quoted from the book. It's almost the same stuff there. But anyway, this idea emerged first as a speculation when I was running projects in the US, and I had Indians and I had Westerners in project teams, and maybe you see that here also. And when there's a project meeting, The Indians are all talking to each other, having many conversations at once. So 1 is talking to 2, and 3 is talking to 4, and 5 is talking to 6 and 7 at the same time, and somebody is involved there talking to this guy and that guy. So it's all complex, multi-parallel processing going on. And the Westerners are very concerned about that, very upset about that, some of them. And they like linear, one person talk, one person resolve, make a decision, number 1, put it down, item 1, then item 2, like that. So I didn't realize this until I came up with this experience many times, that a project meeting would finish and all the Indians would go off and do it. They're very comfortable, they know what to do, they know it. Because they've filtered out all the different things that were said and made them fit in their own mind about what has to be done. But always some of the Westerners would come to me later on and say, I am thoroughly confused, I have no idea what happened. I couldn't make sense of what was going on. So I would then have to have a second meeting for their benefit and put it down in a certain way. So then I learned that to bring harmony, I should have 2 meetings. I should have a free-for-all meeting, let them all talk, brainstorm, blah, blah, blah. And then I have to be the bridge who have to take notes in a certain way. And before the meeting's over, I have to make sure that we put it in a linear, sequential, chronological fashion, and then everybody knows, everybody's happy. So I started doing this. And,
They have 2 forms, brainstorming first,
yes.
and then do all else.
Yes. So first is what the Westerners would be, I would say, okay, this is the chaos section. So just let it be, don't worry. And then we'll order it. Now this has been my experience for a long time because I ran many projects and corporate groups and I found this a behavior pattern. And then but it crystallized during the Kumbh Mela. I went to the Kumbh Mela and it's a huge thing, and the Naga sadhus, they are the ones who don't wear clothes, they go for the dip. So the head of the Naga sadhus invited me to be his guest. His umbrella thing is called Juna Akhada, and they have several lakhs, which means several 100,000 Naga sadhus in that thing. And they're all chaotic by Western standards. They live in little groups, they do all weird things, they all defy norms, that's their way. And they are the prestigious, privileged people who get the first honor of dip. That's the society looks up to such people. So the head of that invited me, and this was an amazing experience. I actually have a film because I took this little flip cam and I filmed a lot of stuff. And I haven't put it up on YouTube yet. I need time to edit it. But it was an awesome experience, and I took a dip with these Naga sadhus. I stayed in their camp and all that. Quite an experience. So after this is over, I was saying my goodbyes and thanking the head of this, the head person for his hospitality, and my taxi was waiting. I was all packed and was sitting in the taxi. I just went there to give my thank you. And there was an American TV crew interviewing him from ABC News. There's a show on Sundays called Sunday Morning. It's a very popular ABC show. And they were doing a documentary on Kumbh Mela. So since this head guy was being interviewed, he said to them, why don't you also interview Rajiv? Maybe he'll have something interesting to say. So because they were interviewing, they wanted to know, they had questions, and he was doing his best to answer them. I could tell that he was being very polite and nice because they're asking these questions, and so he felt that maybe I'll help out. So these guys came to me and said, do you have 5 minutes? We just need 5 minutes of your time. And they had a very organized, a huge team, and they had the satellite dish and a big van, and a very big scale operation. So this 5 minutes turned into 3 hours because of the discussion we had. And when the final event was broadcast, most of it was my discussion actually in the event. Of course, I wish they'd given the raw footage because so many interesting things came out, but they have a policy against giving raw footage. What you view is what you get. So their question was one question, and that took all this discussion for a long time. The one question was, we've been here for a month, and we've been going around asking everybody the same question, and that is, how do we explain to the Americans what is the meaning of all this chaos? That was the question. So could you please answer that, they asked me. So what I told them is this. I said, the American mind is simple. This is very complex. American mind is linear. This is parallel. American cognitive system can handle a certain amount of things hitting you at a time, and you can keep track of it. And this is cognitive overload. This is like you've been hit with so much that you don't know what's going on, so your system crashes. So it's like your cognitive system has a system crash, and that crashing of your cognitive system, which means loss of order, loss of control, because your ego wants control, orderly things. And the loss of that is what you guys have termed chaos. So the chaos is in you. It's not out there. The chaos is in you. The threshold of what you can handle has been exceeded in this huge display of complexity. And since you cannot fathom it and put it into your orderly categories of thinking, it defies all kinds of things that you're used to expecting. Everything is uncertain, there's unpredictability, there's all kinds of things mixed up. And so you do not know how to, you cannot make it orderly, so you cannot see any sense in it. And therefore, to protect your own orderly mind, you call it, hey, that's chaos. So that's your way of dealing with it and protecting yourself from this thing. Whereas if you go out and ask and just watch, one guy is walking, doing something, another guy is just taking a bath, another guy is eating and going that way, and no individual is feeling chaotic. Every individual is just going about doing something, but you are trying to assimilate and make sense of this whole thing, and it doesn't fit the paradigms and the framework that you have been programmed with, your templates, so it cannot contain all this complexity. So this is basically chaos of your system and not chaos that's out there. So they were very fascinated by that. They were quite fascinated by understanding this. And then we went into American history, and I told them all about how when the Europeans came, they considered the Native Americans to be chaotic and living in wilderness, and therefore they had to be civilized. And therefore when they made these very civilized, orderly settlements, and they tried to make the Native Americans comply to that and superimpose their ideas of order and ended up genociding them. Actually, the Native American genocide was a clash between order and chaos.
So they probably cut that.
Huh? They cut that out. They cut that out. Absolutely they couldn't handle it. I wanted that footage so badly because this guy was very smart in interviewing me. But there's a person who makes the footage who's really sincere. But there's boss, and there's boss's boss, and there's somebody has to make sure that this is okay for people to listen to. So this was an interesting chapter, and the cover of the book is actually opposites. These are the devas in the churning of the ocean, Samudra Manthan. These are the devas, and these are the asuras, and this is the spindle with the snake wrapped around it, and this is the story of creation, that opposites struggling, each pulling its own way, and that churns the milky ocean of creativity. That's how things are created. That's how things come. So opposites in mutual tension is not a bad thing. It's not that one has to be annihilated. There is nothing equivalent to Jesus will come back and annihilate Satan, and that will be the end of bad things happening. Because in the Indian idea of cyclical time, this universe will end, and another one will emerge, and things will start again. And the devas and the asuras are always there. It's not that the devas will have one final victory and finish off all the asuras forever. It's never going to be the case. It is not that there will be just good and not problematic things. There is Dharma and Adharma, and it keeps popping up, and it's our job to keep the Dharma under control. You want the chaos under control. You do want the order to sort of have an edge and keep things together, but that is not that you want to eliminate the chaos or eliminate the disorder or things that are troubling you, because you cannot ever achieve that. So I go through a whole lot of examples and also quantum physics talks about the uncertainty that's built into the universe as the very nature of reality. You cannot eliminate that kind of chaos or disorder. That is part of the way things are. So the Indian ethos deals with these things very comfortably. And it is no surprise that both Schrödinger and what was the other guy who Heisenberg were very much influenced by the Upanishads in their thinking about uncertainty and quantum mechanics, and quoted a lot from these texts. And when it was finally accepted by the Western scientists that quantum physics is actually real, and you cannot get rid of this uncertainty built in, it created a huge crisis of philosophy, of science in the West. But the Indian philosophers felt validated. They felt that this is how this whole idea of consciousness playing a role, and the objective reality is not really reductionist and Newtonian, is sort of very nice for us to know because it sort of fits very nicely into our framework. So I discuss all these things in that chapter on order and chaos as one of the very important distinctions between the Indian and Western approaches, metaphysically approaches. And there is also a book I came across by an American historian called Andrew Rotter. He's an American historian, and he got declassified documents from the Johnson era and Kennedy era, Nixon era, on what the secret communications in the US had to say about India. And he came up with chapters, a huge book, explaining what was strange, peculiar, weird about India that bothered the American decision makers during the Cold War. And it was basically chaos. It was basically that if they have so many million gods, then you cannot trust such people because they have moral uncertainty. And monotheism means moral certainty. There's one truth, one God, whereas if there's all these gods, you don't know which God will now give him the inspiration. He may make a deal with me, and then some other God may inspire him to do something else. I cannot trust such a person. India would make an unreliable ally. This is the documents are so interesting. And then what are the images that are played in the American media at that time? And the American scholars and think tanks and academicians are focusing on land of chaos, human anthills. These phrases are very nice. I've summarized them in this book that explain how Americans perceived India to be sort of suffering from moral relativism and chaos and so on. And in fact, in one of the CIA, State Department and President discussions on India versus Pakistan in that Cold War era, it's a very interesting discussion in which the US policymakers say that Islam may be a false monotheism from our point of view, but it's a monotheism all the same. And at least they have one truth. Maybe that truth is not what we agree with, maybe it's a false truth, but at least they have the concept of a single truth. And so if they are an ally, and once they agree to something, then they'll be a reliable ally, and we can trust them because they have moral certainty. Now, of course, history will tell you that maybe that's not exactly how it happened. Yeah? But this is very well documented, that this, for instance, India is non-aligned, which means they don't have a sense of right and wrong because everybody's right, this is right, that side is also right. And the Americans very ticked off with this sort of mindset that, we have to deal with these guys. And also, they have different truth when we talk to them. And this bothered the British also, because the British felt that they said the Hindus are pathological liars, because when you ask them a question, then when you ask another guy, he tells you something else. When you go back to the same guy, he's changed his mind. So then they asked, in the late 1700s, they had a panel to figure out what is the Dharma. They wanted to govern by Hindu laws. So William Jones is considered the person who has discovered the Dharma, the laws of Hindus, as if this is his discovery. And what he did is the first council of Pandits did the truthful thing. they concluded, before William James, someone else, they concluded to the East India Company that Dharma is contextual. It is not like commandments. It is not 10 commandments or something. It's very contextual. So what is the right action is highly contextual. And what may be right in one situation will be in another situation. And what may be right in one part of the country, the customs of another part of the country may be different. So depending on the context and depending on the circumstances, there is a right action to take. And this was considered no good by the British, because you just cannot govern people based on something like that. And so they rejected, they disbanded this group and fired all these guys. And then William Jones took up the exercise of creating the laws of the Hindus. The first edition was called Laws of the Hindus. He published a book in England in 1700s, late 1790s, somewhere there. The first edition was called the Laws of the Gentus, means Gentile. And then they later changed it and said maybe the people won't like that expression, kind of a, slur. So we call it Laws of the Hindus. And there is a big panel in Oxford on a huge inside wall of a huge building, like 3-story high ceiling. And on the big wall, they have this picture of William Jones sitting on a throne or a chair, and looking down, there's all these pundits sitting on the floor. And they're all looking weird. They're all looking very kind of disorderly, looking here and there. And he's sitting in a very orderly way with a pen, like that. And down below says, to William Jones, the man who gave the Hindus their laws. And I have a photograph of that. It took me a year to get that picture, because when I went in for the tour, sometimes you like something so much you want that picture. I have a picture, and that University of Hawaii philosophy book we came out with, we put it on the cover of that book. So if you have it now. To get that picture out took me a year, because every time I'd go back with the camera, they wouldn't let it in. So then I had to bribe this guy, who's one of those guys who lives in Oxford, and I said, now you go and get me this. And he finally got me a nice high resolution picture, which I have, of this whole thing. So this idea of bringing order has meant distortion, because to take something which is not, it doesn't fit the Western grids, you force it to fit, it distorts it. And that's how the caste system, because the jati and varna, it was not like what we now have as a caste system. And the Indian government basically accepted the caste system as constructed by the British. But the British came up with a single dimensional hierarchy in which all the jatis, all the communities, there were several thousand of them, had to be put in a single hierarchy. So they made a judgment based on their evaluation of how well off this group was and what their affluence, or what, according to their criteria, where they would fit. And they made these castes. And then they conducted census after census from 1881. Every 10 years they conducted a census till 1931. And Lord Risley was the Lord in charge of that. And he was very clearly a racist. I mean, he was very clearly into this idea that Darwin's evolution should be applied to civilizations. Some civilizations are more evolved than others. And we, the West, are more evolved, and we are here colonizing them to evolve them. And part of the evolutionary process is to take down one level further and look at all their castes, all their communities, and see who's more evolved and who's less evolved. So in his report, census report, he writes about how these guys are less evolved, these guys are more evolved, that sort of thing. So the idea being, anything that didn't fit, anything that was too bizarre, would be sort of put down. And there was something called the Criminal Tribes Act. I don't know if you know that, but a lot of tribes, I think about 80 some tribes, were declared criminal, because they were just too bizarre. They were like the Naga Sadhus kind of people. They were just too chaotic. And so they were declared criminal, and it was considered lawful to kill anyone at sight. From newborn baby who's two days old, because he's born in that tribe by birth, he's condemned to be a criminal. And the word thug, thugs were a jati who were subverting the British attempts to deforest, because they lived in the forest. There was a jati who thrived on the forest life, And so they would blow up this and kill that guy, and when they would find a big British guy, they would do something to undermine the British project to deforest. And so they were part of the criminal tribes. And there were all these books written about how thugs have supernatural powers, and some of them are 20 feet tall, and all kinds of documents were produced to demonize them, and to such an extent that the word entered the English language as being synonymous for criminal, and now even everybody accepts it, Indians accept it, and the thugs got it genocide, it finished off. So this is the whole order marching as the march of civilization, the whole Hegelian idea, and order taking over what the West has thought of as chaos. And this is the fourth chapter. And since time is running out, I'll do the fifth very quickly. The fifth chapter is basically that Sanskrit contains words that are non-translatable. Several words that are so profound, there's no English word for it. And so my suggestion is that you got to introduce that Sanskrit word into the English language rather than trying to replace it with an English substitute. You got to make it a loan word into the English language, loan it into the English language. Like the word yoga already is not translated because it cannot be exercise, it cannot be gymnastics, it cannot be prayer. It's yoga is yoga. So there's many other words like that, and the fact that they are non-translatable also shows that there's something different about the civilization which is built on those terms, on those categories, because they do not correspond one-to-one with Western terms and Western categories. So the non-translatability of Sanskrit is also evidence of difference that cannot be digested. And preserving these non-translatable terms is a very important thing to preserving that diversity. So the book's thesis is we're being digested into the West unless we are being different in the sense of the book. Unless, in other words, unless we define a civilization, the foundations of civilization based on those distinct qualities that are non-digestible, like the ones I mentioned. No single absolute historical event, but many events, and human ability to transcend and achieve higher states of consciousness without recourse to any belief in history. Integral unity as opposed to artificial or synthetic unity. It's a very big difference. Comfort with chaos, or what is considered chaos to the West, is normal, and there's no fear that this synthetic unity will fall apart in chaos. So we can be relaxed about it because nothing can go wrong. That sort of thing, comfort. And then the non-translatability of Sanskrit words, certain Sanskrit words. These taken together comprise my thesis on what is truly distinct and different, and preserving these differences prevents being digested. So that is my thesis. Thank you very much. The stand, if you hold it, you can go to the person and to me back and forth.
Yes.
And maybe we get more light, or is this enough? Is this enough?
I think so.
Okay. Lights me.
What comes to me directly is about these organizations, because my feeling was that if you say in India this historicity and we don't need any kind of formal society for anything spiritual, but what happened in India in the last 100 years, one see these kind of societies have emerged. Is it a recent thing as an answer, as a competition to the colonizers?
Very good question. Okay, this is a good question. That in the last 100 years, some formal institutional societies have emerged. So there's Ramakrishna Mission, there's Chinmaya Mission, there's Sri Aurobindo Society. These kind of things have emerged. I think yes, to some extent, it is the institutional process. The idea of institution as a corporate body has been introduced to India. It is not an Indian. The joint stock company is not an Indian idea. The way businesses were organized very different in the family and in the Jati community were very differently. The idea of common property and something of a common kind, common purpose, even in business and commerce was differently organized than the Western joint stock company. And I was in a discussion with, this takes me off the spirituality point a little bit, but just to, it's related. I was in a discussion with somebody in Bangalore, who's one of these very wealthy guys. And he was making the point that if you look at India's now recent success in business and commerce, a large part of it has to do with an Indian way of doing business. It's not the joint stock entity necessarily, but it's either a family or a jati community as a sort of a whole joint entity. And how things are passed from generation to generation is quite different in that case. But the corporate, the idea of institutionalized religious lineage, I think is new. Now, Shankaracharya set up the mattas, you know. They are a good counter-example to all this, because they've lasted for more than 1,000 years, many centuries, and there is a very organized lineage and continuity and so on and so forth. That's a good example, but there's very few examples like that. You're absolutely right. And so, you know, I think you need the best of both. The West, for order, has also many successes. Many successes. I think the certain projects, you know, if you want to build a space shuttle or you want to build a, you know, airplane, design an airplane, you need thousands of engineers working in a very organized way, very systematic way. You cannot have everybody improvising and being creative. Military has to be organized. You cannot have a soldier who says, I'll come up with my own improvisation, like raga in music, you know, you come up with your own idea. You cannot improvise in certain things. So I think the Western skill of large organized institutional mechanisms has its own purpose. It's a valuable purpose. And West has also created good institutions, like institutions that, you know, museums, libraries, people who've done philanthropy and built many things institutionally, schools, universities. Now, the research that needs to be done, and I don't know what the answer is, has to do with, you know, how was Harappa and Mohenjo-daro made? Because the Indus Valley civilization has a huge amount of organized systems. You know, there's drainage, there's standardized bricks, and there's weights that are standard everywhere, but there's no huge building which is sort of the emperor of symbolizing central authority. It's all very decentralized. The living quarters are all uniform, like everybody's middle class. Everybody's got a 1 or 2 bedroom place with running water, but there's no big mansion or a palace anywhere. So it's interesting that it seemed like a kind of an equal society of some sort, and without a centralized authority. And there is no, and you know, if you look at the tiles in which the nice letters have been carved and all that, they're very beautifully carved, the alphabetic script, you know. It seems the seals, it's standardized across a huge distance. In those times, how did they make a standard? Unless the modern mind thinks that there must have been a standard control committee, okay? Or there must have been a central factory that made all of these. But there's no archaeological evidence that the bricks were made in one place and then sent everywhere. In fact, they were made separately everywhere. And these tiles were made separately. So how did they come up with a decentralized organization to produce such major things? We don't know. So maybe there is a very unusual way of organizing that existed at some point in time, which was neither today's Western idea or today's Indian idea, but something else that was lost.
I'm happy to hear finally that there is something positive in the West, because Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, all the major yogis want exactly the synthesis of the West and the East at the highest. But what I must say, the kind of description that you have given of India and of the West doesn't correspond to the experience that I have. I understand that living in the USA since so long, obviously this has influenced you, and this is the kind of perception. And as I myself go a lot to internet, in fact I'm really frightened when I see certain things. And when I see the evangelical movement, the Christian movement in the USA, and other things that the Pope is doing and so on. But parallel to this, there has always been a totally different tradition, highly heretical, and I was one of them because I was brought up for 10 years with Catholic nuns. But I always consider them the first yogis of my life, because usually you speak on Christianity in general, but you don't analyze. And I also watched the video with on the interview with Mark Tully and the debate between the two of you.
Yes.
I should say that I seen only half an hour of that, but I fully agree with this position. And one thing he reproached to you is, first of all, the absolutism of your categorization, and also not taking enough into account the Catholic aspect, which is totally different. Because the Catholic aspect, first of all, has an extreme left aspect, which relates directly to Jesus, and Jesus is the avatar for society, of human, of love and compassion and so on. But then there is also the aspect of the Divine Mother, which is only exclusive of the Catholic Church. And I should also tell you that not only I went around for 10 years discussing my findings on yoga with gurus and swamis, the major ones, and every time I was invited even to settle there, every time being respected as a researcher of integral yoga. But I was also very close to Big Griffith. This is where I met my husband and the father of my daughter. So all the things that you have been explaining have never been the object of my discussion with Big Griffith.
So can I answer?
Yes.
Huh?
You can also put a question.
No, the question is
No, but
basically.
you could send an email to you because it's
Oh, no, let me summarize at least some part of the question and then answer that part, because one is her personal autobiography of a lot of respect for Indian tradition with gurus and lived experience, which is very nice and wonderful, and we really appreciate that. But the critical part is that her own experience raised in a Catholic tradition and with Bede Griffiths, who respected Vedanta and all. I've read Bede Griffiths a lot. I've read all his books. I understand it. She and other Catholic, particularly Catholic theologies, she disagrees with my positions on Christianity, and she's also seen a part of my video with debate with Mark Tully, part of it. So let me answer that. I really wish you would see the whole video, and I would like if all of you should see that video. It's on our website. The website is the address is given in the back flap, beingdifferentbook.com.
Which video?
When you go to this,
It's on Auroville.
Yeah.
I can send you.
Yeah, one of our people there put that,
Yeah.
it's now posted on.
So just to give you a recap of that video, Mark Tully is a very pro-Hindu, pro-India BBC correspondent who's lived here, and so this video is a very important one because I'm not taking a radical evangelist, I'm taking a very liberal lover of India. And the video starts with him having read the book, and he had marked, noted and all that stuff. He read it very seriously.
This book?
Yes. And so he says that I wish you not talk about difference, but how we are the same. And that's the theme that keeps coming back 4 or 5 times for the 1.5 hours. And then each time he says we are the same, I give him one non-digestible difference and ask him to accept it, which means you can be the same as me. And he said, no, I won't accept it. So I say, okay, but then it means we have to be the same on your terms. So first I tell him that is there one history and one incarnation, linear history, or are you willing to accept many avatars? And he's not willing to, if you watch the whole thing, he's not willing to accept multiple avatars. Then I tell him that the idea of Satchitanand, we all have Satchitanand, and we do not need recourse to history. And he responds by saying, but that's troublesome, there is some problem with it. He's a very nice, gentle person, but that's his position. Then I ask him if he's accepting karma and reincarnation, and he's saying, if there is some problem with that, it's a good idea, but there's some problem with that. So he has some problem with that. Then I ask him, we have this idea of Shakti as all-pervading everywhere, and he says, we have a similar idea of Holy Spirit. So I say, okay, that's a good idea. Then, all our murtis, all the deities that we worship in form, they are manifestations of Shakti. So why don't you have all these in the church? Why don't you allow us to put our murtis in your church? And he says, that will not be allowed. So I say, well, why not? Why not? Aren't we all the same? So since this is Shakti and it is the same as Holy Spirit, why won't it be allowed? He says, because then we'd be accused of polytheism. So you have to listen to the whole tape. And I really think that tape makes the point that somebody who thinks so highly of Indian Dharma and Indian spirituality, when you push him beyond a certain point, up to a point it's fine. In a very superficial media discussion, everything looks very similar, it's fine. But when you push him to accept certain principles and tenets, he has a problem to do so. So then the conclusion of it is that we are same, but on your terms, or same on my terms. And this is a fair question. So if you want to accept reincarnation and karma, and multiple avatars and no unique historicity, and if you want to accept the Satchitanand and we are all divine and no sinner, and if you want to accept Shakti as an all-pervading and the ability to worship images, because we are not, there's no commandment against that for us, if you're willing to accept these principles, by all means, we'd be very happy to be the same. But if you want me to reject every one of these and then say we are the same, then you're really digesting me, and that is the problem. So I think you have to, I would really request that you look through the entire tape and not just the beginning part of it, and then you can correspond and we can exchange, we can talk about it. Regarding Bede Griffiths, I'm very familiar with Bede Griffiths. I'm very familiar that he condemns and criticizes a lot of history centrism first. He loves history centrism.
Yeah.
He says that Christianity must outgrow this exclusivity claim. And Bede Griffiths evolves over time. Bede Griffiths is Shantivanam and all. I've been, researched that. He criticizes the Christianity. He likes Advaita. He even writes about Christian Vedanta and so on. And he talks about the unity consciousness, and he's sort of doing what Jung did. He does a reinterpretation. He does all that. Now there is a person, a Westerner from Germany, who has written to me very lengthy discussions because she lived in Bede Griffiths' ashram. And she says that he would say all these right good things in front of the local people, but when we were privately together with him, he would tell us that all this is fine, but at the end of the day you have to come through Christ. So it was a very interesting kind of like, we're all together, but we can go up, we can keep going, but the final step you got to go through me,
Sixth and seventh.
that sort of a thing. So I think there is a sort of, I'm writing a book specifically on Catholics, theologians, and by the way, this has been endorsed by Francis Clooney, who's a Jesuit theologian. He's a Harvard professor, and one of these videotapes that's on the network, on the internet, is my discussion with Francis Clooney. You should see that on YouTube. He endorses this book. He does not say this is unfair. He says this is cause for Christians to rethink. He recommends Christians to read this book. So he doesn't hold this view, and he's a Jesuit and he's a well-known guy. He is the Vatican official head of interfaith relations. So he's a big shot in the Vatican and a professor at Harvard. And that's his view. So I would recommend that you should watch that video and see for 45 minutes his evaluation of this book. I give a talk for 35 minutes because that's what I'm allotted. He's allotted whatever time, but he goes on for 45 minutes. And he's basically praising that it's an important book. It's a milestone, he calls it, and it's something that people should read very carefully. So I wouldn't say that I've been unfair. I've talked to a lot of prominent people. Francis Clooney was one of those who read the whole manuscript. I sent it to so many people who are outside my tradition to give me critiques. And he's one of those who read this, gave me a lot of his comments. I liked his comments. I appreciated them. I made many changes where in some places, not in others. And so I think I've tried my best, but despite that, there's bound to be flaws and errors, and I'm learning, and I'm also churning, and I'm appreciative of your feedback, and I will do a better job next time. Yeah? So maybe we'll have more questions also. Yeah, please.
This is a question on my part, which I don't really know there. I'm Jewish, but not by practice. And I know of the concept of the Shekinah. Do you know that?
Yes.
Okay. Does that come close to the Hindu idea of the unity? The
Yes.
presence of the divine.
Yes.
Shekinah means the divine is present.
Yes, yes. I would say yes. The tension within Judaism, see all the traditions, even Christianity has a lot of these ideas. There's an internal tension between bloodlines, tribes, chosen people. That is history-centric. And then these Kabbalah and more mystical type things, which are not history-centric. So these resources certainly exist in almost every religion. I mean, in Islam there is Sufism. So these resources exist. It's a question of which went mainstream and why, who took control of the majority of the people. And the purpose of writing the book is to help people find such things in their traditions which are non-history centric. And if Jews were to say, okay, you know, we can be Jews, but let's go and challenge the rabbi about history centrism. And if the Christians would say that, in the spirit of some of the Christians who are saying that, you know, I work with Matthew Thomas, there's a Father Matthew Fox, and there's another one, Bishop of Newark, Bishop Spong. Bishop Spong wrote a book called Why Christianity Must Change or Die. He wrote that book and he was excommunicated for his proposals. So there is radicals, there are internal dissenters, and I'm providing sharp delineation of what they should negotiate for. And one of the important things I request people in various traditions to negotiate for, including the Hindu tradition, which does have a strain of history centrism also. This book is not for or against any one of these faiths. It's for Adhyatma Vidya and embodied knowing, and for the idea of Satchitanand, and it's against history centrism. And every person in every religion has a right to choose between them. So it is perfectly fine for Christians to say we adopt Jesus as our Ishtadevata. That's perfectly fine. Ishtadevata means chosen deity. But the idea of an Ishtadevata is non-exclusive. In other words, you respect somebody else having a different Ishtadevata. So that is the point. If Jesus is somebody's Ishtadevata and they respect other people having other Ishtadevata, and Jesus is their avatar, and they respect that there are many avatars also, this could be my favorite avatar, like somebody's avatar could be Krishna. But they don't have to deny that Ram never existed. It's just that they are more into Krishna Bhakti, you see. And so I think if people of different faiths could take that message, that's what I'm hoping would happen.
In your studies and communications with people, or in your books, does anywhere esoteric Christianity come forward? I mean, I think there is no problem
Yes.
in understanding intercultural, interreligious.
Yes.
exchange.
Yes. I would like to answer that. I think early Christianity, before Emperor Constantine did his mischief, because Emperor Constantine created the New Testament and the Nicene Creed in the 4th century. And until then, it was also very fluid. You know, the early fathers were very fluid, and there was many different ideas discussed. And you know, what happened, what was left out, we know that the Gospel of Thomas was left out. We know that it was discovered later. What are the other Gospels that were left out? So church historians like Elaine Pagels at Princeton University, she's considered an expert on early Christian history and mystical history, the Gnostics and so on. I mean, if you read those kind of ideas, then it would be fluid enough and not so history-centric. And gradually the idea that a Son of God, the Son of God has come, this is exclusive, the idea of evil and Satan and original sin, and you know, this whole thing gets solidified over a period of time, but in the early periods these ideas were not so strong. So you can find such resources. And you can also find in the later period, you can find like Meister Eckhart and various other people, you can find mystics of very high quality, but somehow the authority of the church did not allow them, out of fear of or being threatened by them, did not allow these lineages to continue. Rather than honoring them and saying, you should continue doing what you're doing and spread more yoga and more of this sadhana, they were exterminated or excommunicated or marginalized or something like that. So certainly the resources have existed elsewhere. It's just that this is a fertile soil where this has been this has been encouraged for a very long time.
Yeah, but I actually mean, in your communications with people, in your research, you never met people who had that esoteric understanding of that religion or any other religion where there could be an understanding.
Yeah, no, I do come across. Yes.
Is it very little in the West?
Yes, I come across people who have an experience of Jesus and do not have anything to do with the institution of church. I think that has been alive for a long time. So there are people like that who would happily accept the vocabulary of Ishta Devta, although they don't have that vocabulary, but the idea is similar, that this is my chosen deity, and I have my own spiritual experience, and I have no problem that somebody has all these other chosen deities. And then there are some very serious writers like Raimundo Panikkar tried to integrate Vedic ideas with Jesus. Raimundo Panikkar did that. This has been a tradition for a long time. This is not the only guy. Teilhard Nan tried to do a bit of that. There are some modern Jesuits who are doing these sort of things. And I'm looking at the influences of Hinduism and Buddhism on Catholicism. It's particularly Catholics and the Anglican Church where this type of thing happens more than in the Protestant side.
I feel it in my being, and I'm wondering, for example, the French, they say vive la différence. And there's a quality in that, which I experience here in Auroville as well. But when I hear distinct, for example, I feel it is more inclusive, whereas different is more exclusive. Am I right?
Okay. Well, it's a matter of how you'd want to define those English terms. In the first chapter, I have a criticism of something I call difference anxiety. Difference anxiety is the first concept I introduce, and difference anxiety is the anxiety that I'm different from someone else. Could be gender, could be race, could be religion, could be ethnicity, could be whatever. So the anxiety, the discomfort of difference is a problem which has led to many, many serious things happening. People have genocided, people have had wars, people have said, I'm right, you're wrong. So then I take this difference anxiety and I say there's two kinds, superiority complex and inferiority complex. Superiority complex says, I'm okay, you are not, so you become like me and I will convert you, or I will, if you're not capable of becoming like me, I'll eliminate you. The superiority complex. That results in imperialism, colonization, all of that. Then there is inferiority complex which says, you're okay, I'm not. I want to mimic and become like you. That's a problem in India. A huge amount of difference anxiety and the absolute craving to become Western. There's a huge difference anxiety suffering of people in Delhi, people I went to college with. They think that I'm spoiling their ability, or they're becoming Western already, and I'm pointing out differences, making them self-conscious of who they are, that aspect of who they are which they have disowned. So it's become, they have a huge troubling reaction to why is this guy talking? We're supposed to drink our scotch and go on a jet somewhere and get a BMW, and we got our iPads, and doesn't he know that we are just like the Americans now? So there is that very arrogant, fast money making, some of it corrupt money, but quick overnight Westerner in India, right? So they have this complex also. So I criticize the difference anxiety from both sides, And then I propose difference with mutual respect. And a difference with mutual respect, also I say you can go further and have difference, celebration of difference. Because difference is that is the Leela. That is the Leela. Is that this is all, once you understand integral unity, then difference doesn't bother you. It's not going to be a threat or problem. There's no superiority, inferiority. It's like an apple is different from an orange. Doesn't mean it's better or worse. They're different, And male and female are different, but they have equal rights. Yeah. So this idea of difference with mutual respect and celebrating difference is what I put in the very first chapter. And a lot of the pages in the first chapter are dedicated to why tolerance is a problem. Tolerance is a patronizing attitude. I tolerate you means something wrong with you. Imagine your spouse saying, I tolerate you in the house. Or imagine your office colleague saying, I tolerate you to sit next to me in my office. Or you're having dinner with somebody and they say, I tolerate you to sit and have dinner next to me. I mean, what an insult. And yet, every time I go to these interfaith events or I meet someone from one of the Abrahamic religions, I ask them, what's your position on people of different faiths? They very proudly say, we tolerate you. And so I've had a lot of problems replacing the word. There was a inter-religious center being set up in Los Angeles at the McKenna Claremont University, which is a Christian-run university, very nice, very popular university, and they set up this inter-religious thing, a big center for inter-religious studies, and I was asked to be the advisor from the Hindu side, and there were advisors from various sides. And when they were doing this grand launching ceremony, everybody was giving a speech, and it was my turn, and the resolution they had drafted to launch this center said we all resolve that we are tolerating each other. So it was my turn, and every one of the speakers went and said, yeah, we Muslims tolerate everybody, we Christians tolerate everybody. Everybody said like that, and so I like to provoke and do things a little differently. So when it was my turn, I stood up and said that I request an amendment in the language, and we should replace it with mutual respect. Because when you tolerate somebody, you could say you're going to hell, but I'll put up with you. You could say that. But when I respect you, it means you're legitimate. Respect means you're legitimate. Your way is legitimate for you. My way is legitimate for me. They may be different, but we respect each other. So it's a higher standard. And the lady who was in charge of this center called me the next day and she said, you created a big commotion and it's caused a huge stir. Now, I didn't think it was that big a deal. I thought it was just a nice remark. And then a few other occasions, similar things happened. And then this idea came to me that, probably a lot of them actually resist mutual respect. And to me it's a simple change, but to them it's not a simple change. So I mentioned it to a Hindu Swami who is head of the Hindu organization that represents many Hindu groups. And in the year 2000, United Nations had a Millennium Summit. Famous Millennium Summit of all religions was held in New York in 2000. And this Swami represented the Hindu group, and I talked to him about this that we shouldn't accept tolerance, we should ask for mutual respect. So in the resolution, which was prepared and circulated, of course they had tolerance. So he said, and every religion was asked to give comments and suggest editing it and changing it, the working draft. So he crossed out wherever it said tolerance, he put mutual respect, and it was not acceptable. And this started a big fight. And New York Times wrote an article a few days before the conference was over that it looks like the conference will fail because there is some language that is, he didn't give the details, but there is some irreconcilable differences, and there is the parties are fighting over language and so on. Cardinal Ratzinger represented the Vatican at that summit, and later he became Pope Benedict, the current Pope. He was Cardinal Ratzinger at that time. And he said we can be tolerance, not mutual respect. And the Hindu guy said mutual respect, Otherwise, we don't sign. We don't sign. So at the very last minute, Cardinal Ratzinger accepted, and the resolution said mutual respect. And this became a very big thing. And if we have a copy of that, we put it up on the internet. And 2-3 weeks later, the Vatican issued an edict ruling saying that when we respect other religions, so they put a little conditioning. When we respect other religions, it is because there is a lot of good in them. But salvation can only come through the church. This is a very important point. Yeah, it means that, you know, I can get you to the final, but you can help. You're learning. It's not that everything is bad about you and so on. So I've had this experience in many places. So then, after 9/11, the Muslim community in the U.S. Felt that they were kind of being, there was a lot of trouble for them in the US, a lot of prejudice against them. So they suddenly wanted to become very close to the Hindu community because we could all stick together as South Asians. So I remember a Dallas radio station interviewing me. I visited there, and usually when I visit some place, there's some media discussions and interviews and so on. So this was a South Asian radio station, and it was run by a Pakistani. So he said, I welcome you, and we need religious harmony, and so what are your thoughts? So I told them that I come from a tradition where instead of tolerance, we like to say mutual respect, because then it's more respectful of each other. And so I gave my ideas about this. And then it was time for callers to call in. And one lady called in, who later I was told is a very prominent community leader, Muslim community leader in the Dallas area, but I didn't know who she was. She called in and she said, Rajiv ji, congratulations, welcome to Dallas. I am so happy to hear from you, from my Hindu brothers and sisters, that I fully tell you that we believe in mutual respect from the Muslim side. So I said, I'm very happy to hear that, but let me tell you that what you are expecting of my faith is I worship images, I believe in karma, I believe that the divine can be feminine, and I'm very glad that you respect all these. She hung up. Yeah. So, you have to push these things beyond just the politically correct facade.
Growing up in Germany, I was always happy that India and America didn't get on in the 60s, 70s and 80s. There was always sort of conflict, and obviously I was sort of on India's side. But then this tilt towards Russia, towards Soviet Union happened within India, in the political arena. How can you explain that?
Well,
I couldn't figure that one out.
Yeah, I think that was that era is called the Nehruvian era. Nehru was the prime minister.
Yeah.
It was a very unique Nehru ideology that was Fabian socialism, built on the Soviet model of centralized economy, which is very un-Indian.
Yeah.
If you really want to understand India today, you must understand the conflict between Gandhi and Nehru. And Gandhi wanted a decentralized village-based economy, Dharma, a society which was true to the Indian tradition, and not a copycat of European civilization. And he had written his book in 1909 called Hindustan, which was a mandate, which was his strategic thinking about why we need independence from the British. And it was 100 years ago being different by Gandhi. This book is inspired by that. And that was Gandhi's critique of the British Empire, an Indian view of British civilization. And this is like 100 years later, my views on American civilization, if you will. So Gandhi believed in a lot of these ideas of Dharma and self-sufficiency in the villages and stuff like that. And Nehru was a product of Cambridge, and he believed in a very Eurocentric view of advancement, machinery, centralized industry, big urban centers, and that's why the villages were neglected, rural education was neglected, and that's even today, it's very sad that India invests so much in the automobile industry and not in water. What the Indian villages need is not a highway system for cars, but a highway system for water to connect the rivers, because there's either floods to some place and not enough water somewhere else. And if the billions of dollars being spent in automobile infrastructure were spent on water, it would be the bottom 50% of the people would flourish, and they would have a huge food production. It would be good for nutrition. And also a problem with the automobile-oriented economy is that it's all based on foreign oil. And trying to become Americans and having cars the way Americans do is not achievable in India, because India's population density is 10 times the United States. The United States has a lot of land. So if Indians have the same number of cars per 100 population as Americans do, the car population will be so huge that India will be a parking lot. Whole India, just people, even with 20 lanes, 50 lanes, you'll not be able to get things done. So this Nehruvian turn and rejection of Gandhi, while kind of making him an ornament of India and the father of the nation, but his ethos has not been carried out. It is more a Nehruvian idea. So India after independence is followed Nehruvian ideas, and that's what India is today.